My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and at 31, I never imagined I'd be sitting in a courtroom fighting for what was rightfully mine. Most people know me as Becca, the quiet architectural designer who spent the last 8 years building not just buildings, but a life with someone I thought was my forever partner. I remember the day I met James Donovan at a charity gala in Chicago. I was 23 then, fresh out of graduate school with my master's in architectural design, working for a small firm and dreaming of making my mark on the city's skyline. James was 32, already established in real estate development, with a charisma that filled every room he entered. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his suits impeccably tailored, and his smile. God, that smile could convince anyone of anything. "You're the one who designed the Richardson Project model," he said, approaching me at the bar. I was surprised he knew my work. It was a small contribution to a larger project. "Just the East Wing concept," I replied, trying not to seem too flattered. "The best part of the entire design," he countered, raising his glass. James Donovan. That night marked the beginning of what I thought was a fairy tale. James wasn't just successful, he was ambitious in a way that made me believe anything was possible. Within 6 months, I was working exclusively on his development projects. Within a year, we were living together in his Lakeshore Drive penthouse. By year 2, we were engaged, and I had left my firm to become the lead designer for Donovan Developments. "We're building an empire together, Becca," he would say, his arm around my waist as we looked out over the Chicago skyline from our balcony. "Everything I do is for our future." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? The properties kept accumulating. Apartment buildings in Chicago, vacation homes in Florida and Colorado, commercial spaces in emerging neighborhoods. James was brilliant at identifying undervalued properties and transforming them. I was the one who reimagined these spaces, breathing new life into forgotten buildings. We were the perfect team. What I didn't realize was how meticulously James documented everything, or so I thought. For tax purposes, he explained, it made sense to put some properties in my name. I signed whatever he put in front of me, trusting him completely. After all, we were building our future together. "It's just paperwork, babe," he'd say, sliding another document across the kitchen island as I made dinner. "My accountant says this is the best way to structure things." The cracks started appearing in our 7th year together. James began taking more business trips, often without much explanation. He became secretive about his phone, and his late nights at the office grew more frequent. I told myself it was just the stress of expanding the business. We were now developing properties in 3 states, and James had his eye on international opportunities. Then came Sarah Winters, his new executive assistant, 25, ambitious, and hanging on James's every word. I noticed the way she looked at him during company events, but I dismissed my concerns. James and I had built too much together for him to throw it all away. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday evening when I came home early from a site visit in Milwaukee. The penthouse was supposed to be empty. James had texted that he was working late again, but I heard his laugh from the bedroom before I even closed the front door. Sarah's giggle followed, and my world collapsed in an instant. The confrontation was ugly. The denial, the gaslighting, the eventual confession when I showed him the text messages I'd seen on his iPad weeks earlier, but had been too afraid to acknowledge. "It just happened, Becca," he said, as if 8 months of text messages indicated something spontaneous. "It doesn't mean anything, but it did mean something. It meant everything. Because 3 days later, I discovered it wasn't just Sarah. There had been others. And worse, James had been systematically moving assets, preparing for this moment for over a year. When I confronted him with bank statements showing large transfers, his demeanor changed completely. The charming man I'd loved was replaced by someone cold and calculating. "You signed a prenup, Rebecca," he said, using my full name for the first time in years. "And we're not even married yet. You'll get what the agreement says. Nothing more." He was right about the prenup. In my love-struck naivety, I'd signed a document that entitled me to almost nothing if we split before marriage. What James didn't know was that I'd been quietly gathering information since finding those first suspicious texts. I'd made copies of property documents, tax filings, and transfer records, anything I could find in our home office during his increasingly frequent absences. 2 weeks after discovering the affair, I moved out of the penthouse into a small apartment in Wicker Park. James seemed almost relieved, which hurt more than his anger would have. He thought it would be simple. I would disappear quietly, taking the modest settlement his lawyers offered, while he continued building his empire with Sarah by his side. But James had forgotten something crucial about me. Behind my quiet exterior and trusting nature was the daughter of a small-town attorney who had taught me one essential lesson: always keep receipts. As I sat in my new apartment surrounded by boxes of my hastily packed belongings, I opened my laptop and began organizing the digital files I'd collected: property deeds, transfer documents, tax filings, all meticulously labeled and dated. Among them, I discovered something James had clearly forgotten: titles to multiple properties he had transferred into my name completely, not just partially as I had thought. I called my father that night. "Dad, I need a good lawyer," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "And I need to understand exactly what these property documents mean." The next day, I met with Catherine Zhao, a razor-sharp divorce attorney recommended by my father's colleague. As she reviewed my documents, her expression shifted from professional sympathy to something approaching delight. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, looking up from the stack of papers, "Mr. Donovan has made a very serious miscalculation." That was 3 months ago. Now, sitting in this courtroom, watching James and his high-priced attorney, Maxwell Bennett, exchange confident smiles, I feel a strange calm. They think this is going to be quick and painless. For them. They have no idea what's coming. The judge calls the court to order, and I straighten my spine. Today, James Donovan is going to learn that I am not as forgettable as he thought. The courtroom feels colder than it should for an April morning in Chicago. I adjust my navy blazer, a new purchase for this occasion, and try to appear composed despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. Across the aisle, James sits with perfect posture in a suit that probably costs more than my current monthly rent. He hasn't looked at me once since entering the room. His attorney, Maxwell Bennett, is a legend in Chicago legal circles, known for representing the city's wealthiest in their divorces and disputes. Though James and I weren't married, the complexity of our intertwined assets necessitated similar legal proceedings. Bennett's reputation precedes him: ruthless, meticulous, and rarely defeated. All rise. The Circuit Court of Cook County is now in session, the Honorable Judge Eleanor Harmon presiding, announces the bailiff. Judge Harmon is a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, with silver hair cut in a practical bob. Her reputation for fairness gives me a sliver of hope, though I know James's legal team will try to paint me as the gold-digging girlfriend who contributed nothing to his success. "Be seated," Judge Harmon says, adjusting her glasses as she reviews the documents before her. "We're here for case number 2023-CH4582, Mitchell v. Donovan, regarding the dissolution of domestic partnership and division of assets." She looks up. "Counselors, your opening statements, please." Bennett rises first, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. My client, Mr. James Donovan, is the founder and CEO of Donovan Developments, a company he built through his own ingenuity and hard work years before meeting Ms. Mitchell. During their relationship, Ms. Mitchell was employed by Mr. Donovan's company as a designer, a position for which she was well compensated. He paces slightly, his voice resonating with confidence. While their personal relationship has unfortunately ended, Ms. Mitchell signed a clear cohabitation agreement that outlines exactly what she is entitled to: 6 months severance pay and retention of personal items acquired during the relationship. Mr. Donovan has generously offered an additional $50,000 to assist with her relocation expenses, despite no legal obligation to do so. Bennett gestures toward me dismissively. Ms. Mitchell's claims to Mr. Donovan's properties and business holdings are without merit and represent an opportunistic attempt to claim assets she had no part in acquiring or developing. We ask the court to enforce the existing agreement and bring this matter to a swift conclusion. Catherine rises next. At 45, she carries herself with quiet confidence that doesn't need Bennett's theatrical flourishes. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about honoring agreements, but not the one-sided document Mr. Bennett references, which Ms. Mitchell signed without independent legal counsel when she was 23 years old and new to both her relationship and professional career." She approaches the bench with a folder. "This case is about honoring the documented property transfers, business arrangements, and tax filings that Mr. Donovan himself executed over their 8-year relationship. Documents that tell a very different story than the one presented by counsel." Catherine returns to our table. The evidence will show that Ms. Mitchell was not merely an employee, but an integral partner in building Donovan Developments. Her architectural designs became the signature style that made the company's properties distinctive and valuable. Moreover, Mr. Donovan deliberately transferred numerous properties into Ms. Mitchell's name, not as gifts, but as part of a strategic business and tax planning approach that he directed. She looks directly at James for the first time. We will demonstrate that Ms. Mitchell is legally entitled to retain ownership of properties already in her name, plus a fair share of the business she helped build through her professional contributions that went far beyond the scope of normal employment, and for which she was often undercompensated relative to their value. Judge Harmon nods. Thank you, counselors. Let's proceed with initial evidence presentation. Bennett stands again, smirking slightly. Your Honor, before Ms. Zhao presents what I'm sure will be a creative interpretation of standard business documents, I'd like to submit the signed cohabitation agreement as Exhibit A and Mr. Donovan's complete asset portfolio as Exhibit B, demonstrating the clear separation between his personal holdings and company assets. He walks a folder to the clerk, then turns to address the court again. Additionally, I'd like to enter into evidence Ms. Mitchell's employment contract and compensation history as Exhibit C, showing she was fairly, even generously, paid for her services. As Bennett speaks, I watch James. He's maintaining his composed facade, but I notice the slight bouncing of his right leg under the table, his tell when he's feeling confident. He thinks this is already won. Furthermore, Your Honor, Bennett continues, his voice taking on an almost amused tone, while Ms. Zhou suggests there are property transfers of significance, our documentation shows that any properties with Ms. Mitchell's name were merely tax strategies where beneficial ownership remained with Mr. Donovan or his company. Ms. Mitchell brought no capital to these arrangements and has no legitimate claim to them. He returns to his seat beside James, who gives him an approving nod. Judge Harmon turns to Catherine. Ms. Zhao, your evidence? Catherine stands, calm and collected. Your Honor, I'd like to begin by addressing Mr. Bennett's characterization of the property transfers. She signals to her assistant, who brings forward several binders. We submit as Exhibit D the complete property transfer documents for 17 properties currently valued at approximately $28.4 million. I hear a slight intake of breath from James's direction. These transfers, Catherine continues, were not merely tax strategies, but complete transfers of ownership, properly filed and recorded with the respective county recorder's offices in Illinois, Florida, and Colorado. Mr. Donovan's signatures appear on all documents, many of which explicitly state gift transfer or ownership transfer without consideration as the reason for the change in title. She places the binders on the evidence table. Additionally, as Exhibit E, we present tax filings from the past 7 years showing that Ms. Mitchell reported income from these properties and paid the associated taxes, with tax preparation completed by Mr. Donovan's own accountants. Bennett whispers urgently to James, whose leg has stopped bouncing. His face remains impassive, but I notice a muscle twitching in his jaw. Finally, Your Honor, Catherine says, as Exhibit F, we present email correspondence between Mr. Donovan and his financial advisors discussing these property transfers as a strategy to, and I quote directly, protect assets from potential business creditors by placing them in Rebecca's name, as she has no connection to the business liabilities. The courtroom falls silent. Judge Harmon reviews the documents carefully, occasionally glancing up at James, whose composure is visibly cracking. Mr. Bennett, Judge Harmon finally says, would you like to respond to this evidence? Bennett stands, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, without having had the opportunity to review these documents in detail, I can only say that any transfers were part of a comprehensive tax strategy. Beneficial ownership was always intended to remain with Mr. Donovan, regardless of whose name appears on paper. Ms. Mitchell understood this arrangement. Did she? Judge Harmon asks, peering over her glasses. Is there documentation of this understanding? Bennett hesitates. It was an implicit understanding based on their relationship, Your Honor. I see, Judge Harmon says, her tone making it clear she doesn't find this convincing. We'll take a 15-minute recess while I review these documents more thoroughly. When we return, I'd like to hear testimony from both Mr. Donovan and Ms. Mitchell regarding these property transfers. As the judge exits, James finally turns to look at me. The confidence in his eyes has been replaced by something I recognize immediately: calculation. He's reassessing, recalibrating, trying to figure out how much I know and what his next move should be. I hold his gaze steadily, allowing myself a small, sad smile. For years, I trusted this man with everything: my heart, my career, my future. Now, watching him frantically whisper to his attorney, I realize I'm seeing the real James Donovan for the first time. During the recess, Catherine leans close to me. "You're doing great. Remember, when it's your turn to testify, just stick to the facts. No emotions, no accusations, just what you know to be true about the property transfers and your role in the business." I nod, taking a deep breath. "What do you think will happen?" Catherine's expression is carefully neutral. "Bennett will try to paint the transfers as something you manipulated James into doing, or as something you misunderstood. They might even suggest the documents were improperly executed. But the paper trail is clear, and Judge Harmon seems to recognize that. When court resumes, the energy in the room has shifted. Bennett's earlier swagger has diminished, and James sits straighter, his expression now carefully blank. "Mr. Donovan," Judge Harmon says, "please take the stand." As James is sworn in, I watch the man I once planned to marry transform into a stranger, composed, charming, and utterly calculated. The battle has truly begun, and for the first time since our relationship ended, I feel a flicker of something unexpected. Not just determination, but strength. James takes the stand with the same confident stride I've seen him use before countless business presentations. He straightens his tie, a nervous habit I recognize, before placing his hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth. "Mr. Donovan," Bennett begins after the oath, "could you please explain to the court the nature of your business relationship with Ms. Mitchell?" James clears his throat. "Rebecca was hired as a designer for Donovan Developments in 2016. She showed promise, and as our personal relationship developed, I gave her increasing responsibility within the company. She was well compensated for her work, eventually earning a 6-figure salary plus bonuses, and these property transfers that Ms. Zhao has presented. What was their purpose?" Bennett asks. James leans forward slightly. "As the company expanded, my financial advisors recommended diversifying how assets were held for tax efficiency and liability protection. Placing properties in Rebecca's name was a strategy they suggested, but the understanding was always that these remained company assets or my personal investments. Was Ms. Mitchell aware of this arrangement?" Bennett continues. "Absolutely," James says without hesitation. "We discussed it extensively. Rebecca knew these were paper transfers only. She attended meetings with my financial team where these strategies were explained. She never contributed financially to these properties, not to their purchase, renovation, or maintenance." Bennett nods approvingly. "And did Ms. Mitchell ever express an understanding that these properties would become hers personally?" "Never," James says firmly. "That would have been absurd. Some of these properties were worth millions, acquired through my years of work before I even met Rebecca. She understood they were being placed in her name as a legal formality, not as gifts." I feel my cheeks flush with anger at his blatant lies, but Catherine places a calming hand on my arm, reminding me to maintain composure. Bennett continues. "In your view, what is Ms. Mitchell entitled to from your relationship?" James sighs, adopting a look of reasonable generosity. "Rebecca was compensated fairly for her work at the company. As for our personal relationship, I believe the cohabitation agreement we signed is clear. However, I've offered an additional $50,000 to help with her transition, though I'm not legally obligated to do so." "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," Bennett says, returning to his seat. No further questions. Judge Harmon turns to Catherine. "Your cross-examination, Ms. Zhao?" Catherine approaches the stand with deliberate calm. "Mr. Donovan, you testified that Ms. Mitchell was well compensated for her work. Are you aware that market rate for an architectural designer with her qualifications in Chicago during this period would have been approximately 30% higher than what you paid her?" James shifts slightly. "I can't speak to market rates. Rebecca never complained about her compensation." "I see," Catherine says. "Let's move to the property transfers. You claim these were merely paper transfers for tax and liability purposes. Could you explain why the transfer documents specifically use language like gift transfer and transfer of full ownership rights? That's standard legal language," James replies smoothly. My attorneys drafted those documents based on what was needed to accomplish the liability protection we sought. Catherine raises an eyebrow. Is it also standard practice to send personal cards with these transfers? She retrieves a document from her folder. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit G, a handwritten note from Mr. Donovan to Ms. Mitchell, accompanying the transfer of the Lake Geneva property in 2019. She hands the note to James. Would you please read what you wrote, Mr. Donovan? James's jaw tightens as he looks at the card. I remember that day clearly. It was our 5th anniversary. To my Becca, he reads reluctantly. 5 years together deserves something special. The lake house is yours, a place for us to build memories for years to come. All my love, James. Does that sound like a paper transfer for liability protection, Mr. Donovan? Catherine asks. It was an anniversary gift presentation, James says, his voice hardening. The romantic language doesn't change the underlying business arrangement. Catherine nods thoughtfully. Let's discuss the Maple Street commercial building in Chicago. Records show you transferred this property to Ms. Mitchell in 2018. Can you explain why you then had Ms. Mitchell sign as the owner on renovation permits, property tax filings, and insurance documents? Those signatures were necessary to maintain the appearance of her ownership for the liability protection to be effective, James replies. I see, Catherine says. And was it also necessary for liability protection that Ms. Mitchell personally attend zoning board meetings as the property owner, or that she be the one to negotiate with tenants, or that she receive the rental income directly into her personal account, income she paid taxes on? James's confident facade begins to crack. Those were operational decisions made for convenience. One final question, Mr. Donovan, Catherine says, retrieving another document. I'd like to enter as Exhibit H this email from you to your accountant dated January 15, 2021. She hands it to James. Could you read the highlighted portion? James scans the document, and I see a flash of recognition in his eyes. He knows exactly what he wrote. Transfer the remaining ownership interest in the lakeside properties to Rebecca, he reads stiffly. With these transfers complete, we've successfully moved approximately 40% of my personal real estate holdings into her name, achieving the asset protection goals we discussed. And the next sentence, please, Catherine prompts. James hesitates before continuing. Since Rebecca and I have no plans to marry, these assets are now effectively shielded from both business creditors and any future divorce proceedings. The best of both worlds. A murmur ripples through the courtroom. Judge Harmon calls for order. No further questions, Your Honor, Catherine says, returning to our table. Bennett quickly requests redirect, approaching James with renewed urgency. Mr. Donovan, could you clarify what you meant by shielded from divorce proceedings in that email? James straightens, regaining some composure. I was simply acknowledging the legal reality that assets in Rebecca's name wouldn't be subject to division in a divorce, because they weren't marital assets. This doesn't change the understanding between us that these were company assets placed in her name for protection. Bennett nods vigorously. And was there ever an explicit agreement that Ms. Mitchell would return these properties if your relationship ended? It was implicit in our entire arrangement, James insists. Rebecca knew these properties represented my life's work. The idea that she would keep them after our relationship ended was never discussed because it was unthinkable. After James steps down, Judge Harmon calls me to the stand. As I walk forward, I feel James's eyes following me. The weight of his gaze, once so comforting, now so calculating, no longer intimidates me. After being sworn in, Catherine begins her questioning gently. Ms. Mitchell, could you describe your professional role at Donovan Developments? I take a deep breath. I started as a project designer, but within 2 years, I was overseeing all architectural design for the company. I created the signature aesthetic that became known as the Donovan style, the modern industrial elements with warm, sustainable materials that distinguished our properties from competitors. And your compensation for this work? My salary started at $65,000 and eventually reached $110,000 plus occasional bonuses, I reply. I later learned this was significantly below market rate for someone in my position with my responsibilities. Why did you accept this compensation? I glance briefly at James. James told me we were building something together, that my real compensation would come from our shared success. He said every dollar we saved on overhead meant more investment in our future. Catherine nods. Let's discuss the property transfers. What was your understanding when Mr. Donovan transferred properties into your name? James presented each transfer differently, I explain. Some, like the Lake Geneva house, were explicitly gifts. Others were explained as tax strategies, but James always emphasized that putting properties in my name meant they were ours, rather than just his. He said it reflected his commitment to our partnership, both personal and professional. Did you ever understand these transfers to be temporary or conditional? Never, I say firmly. James never once suggested I would need to return these properties if our relationship ended. In fact, he often said putting assets in my name was his way of ensuring our future together. Catherine retrieves another document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter as exhibit on these text messages between Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Donovan from July 2020. She hands me the printed messages. Ms. Mitchell, could you read this exchange? I look down at the familiar conversation. I wrote, "Are you sure about putting the Colorado property in my name? It's such a big investment." James replied, "Absolutely sure. What's mine is yours, Becca. I want you to feel secure in our future together. This is as much your empire as it is mine." "Thank you, Ms. Mitchell," Catherine says. No further questions. Bennett approaches for cross-examination, his expression stern. "Ms. Mitchell, you claim you were underpaid, yet you never sought employment elsewhere. Why is that?" "I believed in what we were building," I answer honestly. "And James repeatedly told me that my real compensation would come through our shared assets and future." Bennett scoffs slightly. "Convenient. And regarding these property transfers, did you contribute financially to the purchase of any of these properties?" "Not to the initial purchases," I acknowledge. "But I designed all the renovations, managed contractors, and handled property management for many of them. My work significantly increased their value." "But you didn't put up any money," Bennett presses. "No, I didn't," I admit. "One final question, Ms. Mitchell," Bennett says, his tone turning accusatory. "If you truly believed these properties were gifts with no strings attached, why did you make copies of all these documents and emails before leaving Mr. Donovan? Doesn't that suggest you anticipated a legal battle and were gathering ammunition?" I meet his gaze steadily. "I made copies because I discovered James was having affairs and moving money between accounts. I was protecting myself because I no longer trusted him, not because I was planning litigation." As I return to my seat, Judge Harmon announces another brief recess to review the testimony and evidence. In the hallway outside, Catherine looks pleased. "You did wonderfully," she assures me. "Bennett's attempt to paint you as calculating backfired. It only highlighted that you had legitimate reasons to protect yourself." When we return to the courtroom, there's a palpable tension in the air. James and Bennett are huddled in intense conversation, occasionally glancing in my direction. Something has shifted. As Judge Harmon takes her seat, Bennett stands. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented, my client would like to propose a settlement offer to Ms. Mitchell." Catherine and I exchange surprised glances. Judge Harmon raises an eyebrow. "Proceed, Mr. Bennett." "Mr. Donovan is willing to acknowledge Ms. Mitchell's ownership of the Lake Geneva property and the Maple Street commercial building, plus provide a cash settlement of $500,000 in exchange for her relinquishing claims to all other properties and any interest in Donovan developments." Catherine leans close to whisper. They're worried. The judge clearly sees through James's story. I shake my head slightly. The properties Bennett mentioned are worth perhaps $3 million combined, a fraction of what James transferred to me over the years. "Ms. Zhao?" Judge Harmon prompts. Catherine stands. "Your Honor, while we appreciate Mr. Donovan's willingness to negotiate, this offer significantly undervalues Ms. Mitchell's legitimate property interests and her contributions to the business. We believe the evidence clearly establishes her rightful ownership of all properties legally transferred to her name, which collectively represent approximately $28.4 million in assets." Judge Harmon nods. "I understand both positions. Given the complexity of this case and the significant evidence presented today, I'll take this under advisement and issue my ruling tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned until then." As we gather our materials, I catch James staring at me with an expression I've never seen before, a mixture of anger and something that might almost be respect. For the first time since our relationship imploded, I feel not just the pain of betrayal, but also a growing sense of my own strength. Outside the courthouse, Catherine squeezes my shoulder. "Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow will be a big day." As I walk to my car, my phone buzzes with a text from James. We should talk. Privately. I stare at the message for a long moment, before typing my reply. Everything that needs to be said can be said in court tomorrow. I drive away feeling lighter than I have in months. Whatever happens tomorrow, I've already reclaimed something more valuable than any property. My sense of self-worth. Sleep eludes me the night before the ruling. I lie awake in my modest Wicker Park apartment, replaying moments from the hearing and from my years with James. The text he sent continues to bother me, not because I'm tempted to meet him, but because it's so characteristic of how he operates. James always believed he could charm his way out of any situation, especially in private where his influence was strongest. By 7 a.m., I've given up on sleep. I shower, carefully select a structured gray dress with a subtle pattern, professional but not intimidating, and apply minimal makeup. Today isn't about impressing anyone. It's about standing in my truth. Catherine meets me on the courthouse steps at 8:30. "Ready?" she asks, her expression both supportive and serious. "As I'll ever be," I reply, smoothing my dress nervously. "Whatever happens today," Catherine says quietly as we walk inside. "You've already won something important. You stood up for yourself." The courtroom feels different this morning, charged with anticipation. James and Bennett are already seated at their table, both looking immaculate but tense. James doesn't turn when we enter, but I notice the stiffness in his shoulders. At precisely 9 a.m., Judge Harmon enters, and we all rise. As she takes her seat, I notice she's carrying a substantial written document, her ruling, already prepared. My heart pounds so loudly I'm certain everyone can hear it. "Be seated," Judge Harmon says, adjusting her glasses. "After careful review of all evidence and testimony presented, I'm prepared to issue my ruling in the case of Mitchell versus Donovan." She looks directly at me, then at James, before continuing. "This case presents a complex intersection of property law, contract law, and the increasingly common situation of unmarried couples who commingle assets and build businesses together without the legal protections of marriage." Judge Harmon lifts the document before her. First, regarding the cohabitation agreement signed by Ms. Mitchell in 2016. While this court acknowledges the existence of this document, I find several aspects troubling. Ms. Mitchell signed without independent legal counsel. There was a significant power imbalance between the parties, and most importantly, Mr. Donovan's subsequent actions, specifically the property transfers, effectively created a new understanding that superseded portions of the original agreement. Bennett shifts uncomfortably in his seat. James remains perfectly still. "Regarding the property transfers," Judge Harmon continues, "this court finds Mr. Donovan's testimony that these were merely paper transfers for liability protection to be inconsistent with the documentary evidence. The transfer documents explicitly use language of gift and complete ownership transfer. Mr. Donovan's contemporaneous communications, both written and electronic, repeatedly characterize these transfers as gifts or as building shared assets with Ms. Mitchell." She turns a page in her ruling. Furthermore, the court finds it particularly significant that Mr. Donovan's own emails to his financial advisors reveal an intent to shield assets from potential future divorce proceedings, suggesting he was fully aware of the legal implications of these transfers and executed them with clear understanding of their permanence. My breath catches. Catherine places a reassuring hand on my arm. "Therefore," Judge Harmon says, her voice clear and authoritative, "this court rules that all properties legally transferred into Ms. Mitchell's name, 17 properties in total, as documented in Exhibits D through F, are indeed her legal property. Mr. Donovan's claim that these transfers were conditional or temporary is not supported by the evidence and is hereby rejected." I hear James inhale sharply. Bennett immediately begins whispering to him. "Regarding Ms. Mitchell's claim to a portion of Donovan Developments," Judge Harmon continues, "the court finds insufficient evidence of a formal business partnership that would entitle Ms. Mitchell to an ownership stake. However, there is substantial evidence that Ms. Mitchell was significantly undercompensated for her professional contributions to the company." She looks directly at James. "The court therefore orders Donovan Developments to pay Ms. Mitchell $2 million, representing the estimated difference between her actual compensation and fair market value for her services over 7 years, plus interest." Judge Harmon sets down her document. In summary, Ms. Mitchell retains full ownership of all 17 properties transferred into her name, valued at approximately $28.4 million, plus a compensation adjustment of $2 million from Donovan Developments. Mr. Donovan retains full ownership of Donovan Developments and all other assets currently in his name. She surveys the courtroom. This ruling is effective immediately. I'll entertain any procedural questions now, but the substance of the ruling is final. Bennett rises immediately. Your Honor, we intend to appeal this ruling. In the meantime, we request a stay on the property transfers, pending that appeal. Judge Harmon shakes her head. The properties are already in Ms. Mitchell's name, Mr. Bennett. There's nothing to stay. Your client voluntarily transferred these properties years ago. As for an appeal, that's certainly your right. But I should note that the documentary evidence in this case is exceptionally clear. Court is adjourned. With a tap of her gavel, it's over. Catherine turns to me, beaming. Congratulations, Rebecca. You did it. The reality hasn't fully registered yet. I sit motionless, trying to process what just happened. Across the aisle, James stands abruptly and strides toward the exit, Bennett hurrying after him. Just before reaching the door, James pauses and finally turns to look at me.